They say the world turns upside down when a child is born. Mine did, but not in the way I expected. When Jacob, my husband, first looked at our newborn son, there were no tears in his eyes, no smile, not the slightest urge to hold him. He just stared at him and, like a blow to the head, said, "We need a DNA test." The silence in the room was so thick you could hear a pin drop, and he, with a mocking smirk, added, as if casually, "He's too good-looking to be mine." The air was sucked out of the room. I, confined to the hospital bed, with our tiny Oliver in my arms, just hours after giving birth, was momentarily speechless. Instinctively, I held him close, feeling his soft, pink skin. He gurgled quietly, unaware of the icy silence that had fallen after his father's words. At first, I involuntarily laughed. What else was there to do when the man you've lived with for 4 years spouts such utter nonsense? But the laughter found no support. One of the nurses giggled awkwardly, more out of embarrassment than amusement. My mother, standing by the window and engrossed in her phone, suddenly froze, as if struck by lightning. "Jacob," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "what are you even talking about?" There was no laughter, no joke in response. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at Oliver as if solving a complex puzzle. His eyes narrowed slightly, and that idiotic grin remained on his face. "Oh, nothing," he shrugged casually. "Just stating the facts. These eyes, this hair, this charming dimple on his chin. It can't be that all the best features went to him." I felt my cheeks flush, but not from the compliment, but from the insinuation in his words. A tight knot formed in my chest, slowly constricting my lungs. I tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a pathetic imitation. "Are you serious? You really want to do a test?" Jacob stepped closer to the bed and leaned over Oliver. "Just to be sure," he said in a tone as if he were checking the oil level in an engine, not questioning the paternity of my newborn son. A wave of burning anger washed over my neck. My hands trembled as I carefully moved Oliver into my arms, holding him close, as if protecting him from an invisible threat. His warmth was the only anchor keeping me afloat in the raging sea of emotions. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my mother getting up from her chair. Her arms were crossed, an impregnable fortress, her lips, a thin, disdainful line. She was silent, but her words hung in the air, unspoken, yet deafening. She had never trusted Jacob, and, to be honest, I wasn't so sure myself anymore. I looked at my husband, at the man who held my hand at every doctor's appointment, who so enthusiastically painted the nursery a soft pistachio color, who dreamed of naming our son Oliver after his grandfather. And I saw a stranger. In his eyes, coldness, detachment, some kind of wary suspicion. "Just saying," he shrugged again, as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. In an instant, the world turned upside down. The room, previously filled with light and joy, dimmed. Even the quiet breathing of the sleeping Oliver seemed somehow vulnerable. The shadow he cast fell on everything around. Why did his words hurt so deeply? Was I not good enough? Did he not trust me? Questions swirled in my head like a disturbed hive. There were no answers yet. But I knew one thing. This moment, which should have been the happiest in my life, had turned into an ominous premonition. The beginning of something I was completely unprepared for. After Jacob's words, the world turned upside down, not only in the room, but inside me. It would seem that after childbirth, all thoughts should be only about the child, counting tiny fingers, remembering his miniature size, falling in love again with every flutter of eyelashes. But I was haunted by Jacob. His words. 2 days later, we were discharged. My mother insisted on helping, but I felt that she didn't trust Jacob, that she was afraid to leave me alone with him. "You're exaggerating," I said, but she just pursed her lips sympathetically and looked at me with pain in her eyes. Jacob, on the other hand, behaved as if nothing had happened. He kept bringing up the DNA test. He changed diapers, cracked jokes, even took a selfie with Oliver for Facebook, captioning it, "My mini clone is growing." I tried to ignore it, convinced myself that it was just a stupid joke, said at the worst possible moment. But inside me, anxiety settled, a quiet, gnawing pain that I couldn't describe, but felt in every bone. It wasn't just a glance thrown in passing, but something more, a studying, penetrating gaze that he gave Oliver. One night, I found him frozen over his son's crib, as if in a trance. He didn't even notice my presence, he was so lost in his thoughts. His brows were furrowed, and his eyes, slightly narrowed, seemed to be trying to discern something hidden, some elusive detail. When I entered, he seemed to snap out of a trance, flinching slightly. "Just wondering when he'll start looking like me," he muttered, waving off my gaze. I forced a smile, but something in his voice, some false note, sent shivers down my spine. And then the little things started, insignificant events that I might not have noticed if I hadn't already been on edge. A call from the hospital from a nurse. Lindsay, I think her name was. She informed me about a routine checkup. Her voice sounded polite, but I could have sworn I detected a strange tremor when she asked for Oliver's hospital bracelet number. I dictated the number to her, and after a long, agonizing pause, she stammered that everything was fine. "Is everything really okay?" I pressed. She answered in the affirmative, but there was something unspoken in her tone, something that set me on edge. Later that night, driven by an inexplicable anxiety, I rummaged through Oliver's hospital documents, and then my gaze caught on one detail, the bracelet that was put on him immediately after birth. Something about it seemed wrong, alien, like a false note in a harmonious melody. Just one digit, a single character in my son's identification number was different from mine, a trifle, a typo. But once doubt crept into my soul, it began to eat away at me from the inside. For hours, I sat on the internet, frantically searching for errors in newborn records, as if I had fallen into a bottomless rabbit hole from which there was no escape. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I showed the fateful paper to Jacob. He looked at me in bewilderment and smirked. "Are you serious? You were just complaining when I suggested something was wrong, and now you're acting like the baby isn't ours." I opened my mouth to object, but he interrupted me. "Emma, honey, you're just tired. You just gave birth, your hormones are raging. Don't let this nonsense get into your head." He gently kissed me on the forehead and left, leaving me alone with a pile of medical documents and a head full of tormenting doubts. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just going crazy from exhaustion. But why couldn't I shake off this oppressive feeling that something was wrong? I started obsessively checking everything. The birth certificate, the bracelet on his tiny hand, old ultrasound records, photos. I became a shadow of myself. A mother with a newborn in her arms and a browser history filled with the most horrifying scenarios that made my blood run cold. Fear was in my eyes, and my hands trembled as I sorted through those damned papers. I desperately tried to convince myself that Jacob was joking about this test, but somewhere deep down, Fear had taken root. What if he's right? The thought haunted me. And then, a few days later, he brought it up again. No yelling, no accusations, not even a hint of anger. He just casually dropped it over morning coffee, as if he were scheduling a dentist appointment. "I found a private clinic that does same-day DNA tests," he said, sipping from his mug. "Confidential, reliable." I was stunned. Had I heard correctly? "Are you still on about that?" I managed to say. He looked up. There was an undisturbed calm in his eyes, but it was too controlled, unnatural. "I think it'll just help us both feel secure." "Both?" I whispered, feeling everything inside tighten. I didn't answer immediately. My gaze was fixed on Oliver, curled up on my chest. His tiny lips twitched in his sleep. He was so serene, so perfect. The very thought that someone might doubt his parentage, especially his own father, seemed sacrilegious. But hadn't I doubted it myself? That ill-fated identification number, the nurse's strange tone, the way Jacob looked at him in the dim light, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. "You said it was a joke," I whispered, not taking my eyes off Oliver. Jacob shrugged. "Sort of. But look, Emma, won't it reassure you too? You're not yourself. You're all on edge." He was right. Undeniably right. But something in his voice grated. Not concern, but a cold calculation, as if he had already built his scenario and was just waiting for me to fit into it. That night, sleep eluded me. I stealthily watched Jacob. Not that I was afraid for Oliver, but I suddenly realized I no longer knew this man. Or maybe I never had. In the morning, I dialed the hospital number. I explained that I had questions about Oliver's birth record. I was transferred from one person to another until I finally got to an administrator named Jessica, whose voice sounded wary. "Everything looks normal on our end," she said after a long pause. "Healthy boy, born at 3:42 a.m., no complications." But the bracelet on his wrist, it didn't match mine, I squeezed out. "Just one digit, but—" "Oh, that happens," she blurted out too quickly, unnaturally quickly. "We've updated the marking system since then." Before I could ask a question, she cut me off. "If you need a printout, contact the patient records department." I froze with the phone in my hand, as if everyone around me had conspired to cover their tracks. As if you pretend long enough that nothing happened, it will simply disappear. That same day, I started rummaging through Jacob's things like a woman possessed. Old documents, school albums, everything I could get my hands on. I convinced myself that I was just curious, but deep down, I was looking for a clue, anything to confirm my worst fears or dispel them. But there were gaps. No childhood photos, not a single childhood memory, just a few adult IDs and a university diploma, which, I suddenly realized, didn't even have a middle name. How could I not have noticed this before? Or maybe I just didn't pay attention. When I asked him about it later, he brushed it off with a laugh. "Remember I told you? The fire destroyed all my childhood things." Yes, he had said that. But I couldn't remember any details. Every little thing now seemed like a thin thread, and once you pulled on it, it became impossible to stop. And yet, I agreed to the DNA test. Not because I doubted Oliver's paternity, but because I needed proof. Not of Oliver's identity, but of Jacob's own. Of course I kept quiet. I just nodded, squeezing out a dry, "Okay." And at that moment, Jacob breathed a sigh of relief. That's when it dawned on me. He wasn't afraid of what we might find out, but of the fact that I would stop searching for the truth. The day of the DNA test was scheduled for Thursday. Jacob took care of everything, called the clinics, filled out a bunch of papers, and even drove us there himself, as if it were a normal family outing. He was impossibly calm, and in my chest, it felt like barbed wire had settled, constricting with every second I looked at him. Oliver, dozing peacefully in his car seat in the back, was engrossed in examining the ceiling and kept dropping his tiny socks. He was the only one in that car who seemed truly calm. I envied him. We submitted the samples, mine, Jacob's, and Oliver's, and were promised results in 5 business days. As we were leaving the clinic, Jacob tried to joke, "I bet he's 80% angel and 20% a complete headache." But I barely heard his words. My thoughts were already racing. 5 days. A whole 5 days of agonizing waiting. 5 days of living in limbo, knowing that my husband doubts that our son is his child, and realizing that I myself have no idea who he really is. That night, sleep shamelessly evaded me. Pretending to study the phone screen, I lay next to the peacefully sleeping Jacob, but my thoughts were swirling in my head. His story about the fire that mercilessly devoured the fragments of his childhood sounded suspiciously smooth, like a rehearsed text. Why had this story never come up before? In the morning, leaving Oliver in my mother's care, I went to the hospital again. Lying about a forgotten blanket with my son's embroidered name, I slipped past the registration desk and found myself in the maternity ward. Seeing Nurse Lindsay, the one with the worried expression on her face after the birth, I felt a flash of hope and a chilling fear at the same time. She recognized me immediately. "Emma, right?" she said with a gentle smile. "How's the baby?" "Everything's fine," I replied, trying to remain calm. "But I have a strange question." I told her about the mismatched bracelet, about that fateful digit, about the subsequent phone call. Expecting her to dismiss my words, I saw her face rapidly lose color. I'm not supposed to talk about this," she whispered, nervously looking around. But that night, we did record a possible discrepancy. Just for a moment, some kind of mess happened in the system, and data on 2 babies appeared under your number, but the error was immediately corrected. Management said it was a glitch and told us to forget about it. The blood drained from my face, leaving a freezing chill. Was Oliver ever taken out of the room without me? I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Lindsay hesitated, avoiding my gaze. For routine checkups, yes, but it wasn't for long. "What do you mean, not for long?" I insisted, feeling the panic rising inside. She was silent, and that silence screamed louder than any words. Thanking her in a trembling voice, I left the hospital, as if in a dream. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the steering wheel. My mouth was dry, and in my head, like a persistent siren, the phrase pulsed, "2 children under your identification number." I couldn't tell Jacob about this until I figured everything out. I needed more information, more truth, and I started digging. Social media, online archives, anything that could shed light on Jacob's past. I even delved into public record databases, something I never would have considered before. I had become a detective investigating my own marriage, and the thought burned like acid. But the longer I looked, the more the details slipped away. Not a single trace of a high school graduation, not a single photograph dated before 2012. And, most strangely, I couldn't find a soul online who remembered him before college, not even a childhood friend. It was as if Jacob had sprung into existence at the age of 21. I stared at the empty profile picture on an old alumni page and an icy knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I had agreed to this damn DNA test to prove that Oliver was our son, but now I didn't know what scared me more: the thought that Oliver wasn't his, or the growing suspicion that Jacob wasn't who he claimed to be at all. The call came at dawn on Wednesday. I was standing in the kitchen, cradling Oliver in my arms, still in my pajamas, when the phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Instinctively, I wanted to hang up, but something inside me froze, and I pressed answer. "Mrs. Smith?" a calm, detached voice said. "This is Dr. Davis from Oakwood Medical. We need you and your husband to come in today for a personal discussion of the paternity test results." "Personal?" I whispered, feeling my throat dry up. "Yes, it's urgent." My stomach plummeted. I couldn't say a word, just nodded, as if he could see me. When I told Jacob about it, he didn't ask a single question. His silence was more frightening than any words. He breathed out just one word: "Finally," and snatched the keys. The drive to the clinic was filled with oppressive silence. Oliver, sleeping peacefully in his car seat, remained oblivious to the storm raging around us. I stared out the window, desperately trying to calm my racing heart. At the clinic, a nurse led us to a small, impersonal room. It was piercingly cold, sterile, as if warmth itself had been deliberately banished. The digital clock on the wall ticked away with deafening insistence, each second pounding on my nerves. Finally, Dr. Davis appeared. A middle-aged man with silver in his hair and a no-nonsense look. He sat down in the chair opposite us, opened a file, and paused. A pause so long that I physically felt my chest tighten with anxiety. "I'll be direct," he said. "The test results have come back, and they are quite unusual." I held Oliver tighter, suddenly realizing how warm, how real he felt in my arms, my only anchor. Dr. Davis looked at me first. "Emma, biologically, this child is not related to Jacob in any way." I didn't even flinch. Somewhere deep down, I already knew it. But then he turned to Jacob, his gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than it should have, and something strange flickered across his face. Hesitation, perhaps, even fear. "And Jacob," he continued, lowering his voice, "you are not the biological father of this child, but more importantly, your DNA does not match any records associated with the identification you provided." Jacob froze, as if turned to stone. I stared at him, expecting to see at least a shadow of confusion, indignation, anything. But his face remained impassive, not a single tremor. Dr. Davis closed the folder, and the sound echoed in my head. "We ran a cross-check with our internal database. Your name, date of birth, even the photo. It all triggered a federal alert." Cold gripped me from the inside. "What? What do you mean?" I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. Dr. Davis didn't answer. He picked up the phone on the desk, pressed a button, and spoke the words that would forever be etched in my memory. "Security, to room 4 immediately." Time seemed to stop. Slowly, as if in slow motion, I turned to Jacob. And for the first time since I had known him, panic flickered in his eyes, just for a split second. But then it was gone. "What the hell is going on here?" I breathed, feeling the ground slipping away beneath my feet. Jacob stood up abruptly. "This is absurd," he hissed through his teeth. "You think I'm some kind of imposter?" But Dr. Davis was unwavering. "We don't think, we know. Your DNA matches that of Michael Harris, arrested in 2014 and who escaped shortly after posting bail. The real Jacob Smith died in a car accident the following year. We don't yet know how long you've been living under his name." The room swam before my eyes, the air seeming to evaporate. My husband, the father of my child, the man I adored, was a ghost. As two uniformed security guards appeared in the doorway, "Jacob!" No, Michael, cast a glance at me, devoid of guilt or remorse. Only a shadow of sadness flickered across his face, as if for a moment he himself regretted that he couldn't be who I thought he was. And just like that, he was gone. Out of my life, out of Oliver's life, out of the web of lies we had been living in. The tears didn't come immediately. Not when the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, not when the door slammed shut behind him, not even when Dr. Davis handed me the DNA printout, the final, merciless proof that this wasn't a nightmare. I sat there, paralyzed, holding Oliver close. His little head nestled comfortably under my chin, and he seemed like the only tangible, real thing I had left. The following days turned into a torturous walk on shifting ground. Time dragged on, everything felt heavy as lead. As soon as this monstrous story leaked into the local news, reporters besieged me. Man steals identity, poses as husband and father. They dubbed it a bizarre paternity case with criminal undertones. I despised those words. This isn't just a story. It's my life, seared onto my heart. It turned out Michael, or Jacob. Who even is he, to be honest? Had been changing faces like gloves for years, running from debts, escaping lawsuits, even whispers of fraud in another state. Cruel? No. He never raised his fists. But this falsehood, this betrayal, it cut sharper than any blade. What kind of person can invent an entire life to be with someone? And God, what kind of monster becomes a father while mired in lies? For a while, I drowned in self-blame. I replayed every moment with him, every birthday, every burst of laughter, every "I love you," like a bloodhound, sniffing out cracks, missed signs, anything that would have indicated the deception. But that's the whole point. People like him are brilliant actors. They become exactly who you want to see, who you need. But the worst part? Oliver. My Oliver. I was suffocated by a primal fear that he, too, had been switched, that I had mistakenly left the hospital with the wrong child. I insisted on an investigation, and the hospital confirmed what Nurse Lindsay had been trying to tell me. A system error, some terrible mix-up, had fortunately been corrected before our discharge. Oliver hadn't left my side for a second. He was mine from his first breath. And yet, in some twisted way, Michael had managed to turn that glitch to his advantage. He fueled my doubts, amplified the confusion, made me question everything just so I wouldn't start. Questioning him. Brilliant, cruel, calculating. Weeks went by before I could say his name out loud, and even more time to stop mentally calling him Jacob. Now, Oliver and I are getting back on our feet. We've temporarily moved back in with my mom, Caroline, who hasn't once uttered that devastating, "I told you so." She just hugged me when I finally broke down, letting the tears flow, and she holds Oliver like he's the whole world, because to me, he is. I filed for divorce. Surprisingly, there were no legal complications. You can't stay married to someone who never existed. Sometimes I still get letters addressed to Jacob. Without opening them, I send them straight to the trash. But there are other nights, late ones, when Oliver is asleep and the house is quiet. I think about the man I thought I loved, about that version of him that sat with me at 3 a.m. during feedings, painted the nursery a soft pistachio green, and kissed me on the forehead before every doctor's appointment. In those moments, I feel my heart clench with longing, and my head is filled with questions that will never be answered. Was it real, or just another layer of lies? I don't know. Maybe I never will. But one thing I know for sure. The truth sometimes hits, not just hard, it knocks the ground out from under you, forcing you, like after an earthquake, to rebuild your life. Reevaluate everything to understand who you are now, without the person you naively thought would always be there. And in this chaos, in this painful reconstruction, you suddenly discover something more: strength. You find yourself. And I, in addition to everything else, found Oliver. And that, believe me, is more than enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had doubts in your relationships, in the reality around you, even in your own instincts, know that you are not alone. Sometimes the most brutal truths lead us to the strongest versions of ourselves. If my story touched you, if it resonated with you, or reminded you to trust your intuition, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need to hear it right now. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other such sincere, honest, and powerful stories. Your support means more to me than you can imagine. And who knows? Maybe the next story you hear will be the one you need the most right now. Until next time, take care of your heart and trust it.